In the dead of night, halfway over the Atlantic Ocean, something unimaginable happens aboard a massive Airbus A330. Aboard this flight, 306 passengers and crew are about to face a nightmare that no one could have predicted. The engines sputter and die. The hum of the turbines, which had been so constant, fades into a haunting silence. The lights go out. Oxygen masks drop from above. The aircraft begins to drift, aimlessly gliding toward the vast ocean below. In the cockpit, the pilots are stunned. Their instruments are flashing warnings, but they can't make sense of it. How could this be happening? Their massive, state-of-the-art aircraft is suddenly falling out of the sky, and they are forced to make life or death decisions with precious little time. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the flight attendants are preparing the passengers for what could be a final farewell. An emergency ditching in the ocean, one that would almost certainly spell disaster for everyone on board. This isn't just a technical failure. This is a story of how human psychology and decision-making can mean the difference between life and death. How can people make split-second decisions when faced with the unknown, when information is unclear and time is running out? The calm before the storm. It all began on the evening of August 23, 2001. Flight 236, an Air Transat Airbus A330, took off from Toronto Pearson Airport in Canada. The destination, Lisbon, Portugal. A routine 7-hour flight across the Atlantic, carrying 293 passengers and 13 crew members. For most of the passengers, it was a simple holiday. Some were looking forward to sun-drenched beaches. Others were returning home to Portugal. No one knew that a hidden flaw in the aircraft's engine would soon turn their dream vacation into a fight for survival. The Airbus A330, a technological marvel, was known for its safety and reliability. Automated systems, sensors, and computers work seamlessly to keep the plane in the air. The aircraft itself was only 2 years old. There was no reason to believe anything could go wrong. The unseen threat at the helm of this flight were two experienced pilots. Captain Robert Shea, with over 16,000 hours of flying time, was a seasoned veteran, having flown everything from seaplanes to jets. His co-pilot, First Officer Dirk Deeger, though younger, had 5,000 hours under his belt and was well trained on the Airbus A330. But as the plane reached the halfway point over the Atlantic, something strange appeared on their instruments. The right engine was sending out multiple warning signals. High oil pressure, low oil quantity, and low temperature. The combination of these readings made no sense. The pilot scrambled to check their manuals, but nothing in the books explained what they were seeing. They contacted Air Transat's maintenance control, but by the time they received a response, things were already starting to get worse. The fuel crisis. Minutes later, a warning appeared this time, a fuel imbalance. The fuel tanks on the left and right wings weren't balanced as they should be. They quickly opened the cross-feed valve to balance the fuel. But soon, something even more terrifying happened. The plane's fuel supply began to drain at an alarming rate. It was as though the A330 was losing fuel faster than it should have. The pilots were now faced with an impossible decision. Their plane, which should have had more than enough fuel to reach Portugal, was quickly running dry. They were halfway across the ocean, and their only option was to divert to the Azores Islands, an isolated group of Portuguese islands in the middle of the Atlantic. But with just a few tons of fuel remaining, wasn't enough to get them there. They knew it. The odds of reaching land were slim. The nightmare scenario was becoming a frightening reality. The missing clue. The pilots were forced to consider a terrifying possibility of fuel leak. But something didn't add up. There had been no bangs, no loud noises, no turbulence. Everything had been normal for the first few hours. Despite the rapid fuel loss, the pilots couldn't believe it. They assumed the readings were faulty. After all, a fuel leak on a modern aircraft was nearly unheard of. But the situation was getting more dire by the minute. Even though the evidence was mounting fuel imbalance, rapid fuel consumption, they couldn't shake the idea that this might just be a computer glitch. The pilots were experiencing what psychologists call confirmation bias. They were looking for evidence to confirm their original assumption that something else was wrong, rather than considering the possibility of a fuel leak. The fatal mistake, but the truth was even worse than they realized. Deep inside engine number 2, a hydraulic pipe had been vibrating against a fuel line, slowly rubbing through the casing. It had caused a massive fuel leak, which was now draining the plane's tanks at a frightening rate. In their rush to solve the problem, the pilots had missed the critical signs. And now, as they tried to troubleshoot with maintenance control, the fuel continued to drain away. By the time they decided to act, it was almost too late. The final descent as the situation became more critical. The pilots made a daring decision. They began descending toward the Azores, but the fuel had all but run out. With their aircraft rapidly losing altitude, the crew prepared for a crash landing in the cold, unforgiving ocean below. What followed was nothing short of miraculous. Against all odds, the pilots, with nerves of steel and a bit of luck, managed to glide the aircraft toward the small airport on the island of Santa Maria. Incredibly, everyone on board survived the ordeal. But this was not just a story of technology failing. This was a story of human psychology, of how our minds work under pressure, and how sometimes, even the best trained professionals can make mistakes in the heat of the moment. Air Transat Flight 236 is a powerful reminder of the dangers of human error, the complexity of decision-making under stress, and the thin line between disaster and survival. Would you have made the same choices? Or would you have seen the warning signs that everyone else missed? The first signs of trouble as the plane reached cruising altitude. The flight was uneventful until early the next morning, over the Atlantic, about halfway to their destination. The cockpit display showed strange warnings from engine 2, the right side engine. The oil pressure was unusually high, and the oil quantity and temperature were both off. But nothing in the manuals could explain these anomalies. The crew called maintenance, but the problem wasn't urgent enough to act on. Yet, slowly, the situation began to deteriorate. Fuel imbalance. The first clue. A little over half an hour later, the cockpit alarmed again. A fuel imbalance between the left and right tanks appeared on the display. Not an immediate threat, but a warning. The pilots quickly activated the cross-feed valve to balance the fuel, hoping to resolve the issue. But things were getting worse. And fast. A nightmare unfolds despite their best efforts. The fuel indicators showed a rapidly plummeting fuel level. They were halfway across the ocean, and they didn't have enough fuel to reach their destination. The pilots chose to divert to the nearest airport on the Azores Islands, about 240 kilometers away. But there was a problem. The fuel was vanishing at an alarming rate. They were losing fuel far faster than the plane should have been consuming it. The plane now had only 7 tons of fuel, just 6% of its total capacity. The pilots thought this had to be a malfunction. They didn't believe they had a fuel leak. Here's where human psychology played a pivotal role. The power of bias, confirmation, and framing. When the pilots saw the strange readings about their fuel and engine oil, their minds went into overdrive. They framed the problem in terms of a computer glitch. After all, there hadn't been any turbulence or sudden events to suggest a real leak. This is a classic example of confirmation bias, where people tend to seek evidence that confirms what they already believe, even when presented with contradictory facts. The pilots dismissed the signs of a fuel leak, thinking the computer was wrong. But there was a framing bias as well. Faced with the decision of whether to descend and reduce altitude, the captain framed it as a choice between a moderate risk descending versus a potentially catastrophic one running out of fuel at 39,000 feet. He chose the latter, assuming the risks would be less disastrous at high altitude. But this, as we know now, was a fatal miscalculation. Engine failure, and the real crisis at 6:13 a.m., engine 2 flamed out. The fuel had run dry, but there was still a glimmer of hope. The captain pushed the remaining engine to full power and began descending, hoping to reach the runway. But at 6:26 a.m., the unimaginable happened. The left engine failed too. Now, with both engines out, the plane was essentially a glider. It had lost electrical power, and the flight crew had to rely on a tiny, emergency ram air turbine for power just enough to keep the critical instruments working. The descent, a test of nervousness. Captain Pitch was faced with the most challenging flight of his life. The plane was plummeting towards the ocean, and the only thing keeping them alive was his ability to glide. The plane, with no engines to generate power, and crucial systems failing one by one, the captain had one objective: keep the plane in the air long enough to reach the runway. The passengers, unaware of just how bad the situation was, were bracing for a water-ditching, a nearly certain death sentence in the dark, turbulent Atlantic. But Pitch wasn't giving up. The impossible glide with just 120 kilometers left. Pitch knew that without power, every second counted. He couldn't afford to lose too much altitude too quickly. He was gliding at a speed carefully calculated between the stall warning and safe descent levels, trying to balance the plane's energy and keep it high enough to make the airport. The aircraft was difficult to control, with hydraulic systems failing and crucial controls becoming unresponsive. Yet, he pushed on. It was a race against time, with every minute a step closer to either a miracle or disaster. Final approach. One shot. One shot sees the airport came into view. The plane was still too high for a normal landing, but with no other option, Pitch had to circle back in a nerve-wracking 360-degree turn, losing altitude. As the runway lights flickered in the distance, it became clear. This was it. No go-arounds. No second chances. With the final push, Pitch brought the plane in for a landing, hitting the runway at 100 knots fast and dangerous. The tires exploded on impact, but somehow, against all odds, the plane stayed intact. The massive aircraft skidded to a halt, barely stopping before the end of the runway. The aftermath: incredibly, everyone on board survived. All 306 people walked away from what could have been a tragic disaster. But questions lingered. Why hadn't the pilots acted sooner? Why didn't they trust their instruments showing the rapidly dropping fuel? The investigation revealed that the fuel leak had been caused by faulty maintenance. The wrong part had been installed on the engine, causing a hydraulic line to rub against a fuel pipe and rupture it. A heroic landing despite the missteps leading up to the emergency. The crew's handling of the situation was nothing short of heroic. Captain Pitch eased calm under pressure. His ability to adapt and problem solve, and his sheer determination to save lives made him a hero. As for the psychological factors that played a role, they were a stark reminder of how human minds can struggle in high-pressure situations. The pilots had made a series of decisions based on bias, incomplete data, and mental shortcuts, ultimately risking more than they realized. But in the end, they defied the odds, stretching their glider like descent to a miraculous landing.